I want to welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. The Gonzaga Socratic Club exists to philosophically examine Christian worldview issues modeled on the Oxford Socratic Club that was presided over by Christian apologist and author C.S. Lewis. And our motto, like theirs, is to follow the argument wherever it leads. In case you're wondering, we don't always talk about Socrates. We follow the example of Socrates philosophically in reflecting on arguments, reflecting on reasons for thinking about the Christian faith in particular. Of course, the central claim of the Christian faith is the claim that we celebrate not too far hence. In the season that we're entering into, Christmas, we celebrate the entrance of God, the invasion of God into history. And that question of thinking about how God is man, how there is a God-man, is a central problem that has occupied Christian thinkers since the first centuries of Christianity. And indeed, it's a particularly relevant one for philosophers to think about because from the beginning, philosophical tools have been brought to bear in trying to think about this question of nature, substance, reality, and so forth. And our speaker today argues that the German thinker Schelling has particular resources to bring to bear on the question of Christology. Our speaker, Dr. Tyler Tritten, is a lecturer here at Gonzaga, but also an Alexander von Humboldt Scholar, Fellow. What's the official word? Postdoctoral Research Fellow. And so we're very pleased to have him with us today. Please welcome Dr. Tyler Tritten.
So thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank David very much for inviting me. I was very honored that he did, very intrigued. And it's one way I think that even though I am just a lecturer or an adjunct, I don't feel as if I've actually been treated that way, as if it were a low stature. And so I want people at Gonzaga to know that hasn't gone unnoticed on my part, and I don't take it for granted being invited to speak in a venue like this. And so thank David for that. And he thought that I was going to talk about Schelling on God, which I am in a certain sense. That's what motivated him to ask me to speak about this. But I was like, well, I can be way more scandalous than that. I can, in fact, present a Christology, which is more scandalous because it's going to be something quintessentially Christian then, rather than something that could hold for any religion. And it's going to be something that I'm going to argue at least that the Incarnation is going to be necessary for God's essence, or at least God's essence as a person. So if God were not incarnate, or more precisely, if the Logos did not become incarnate, then God would not be a person. And then thirdly, I'm going to say that because of this, there are reasons that we can argue for the exclusivism of this Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. That this would be true at the expense of other religions, which of course is a very scandalous claim. Whether I would hold to this myself might depend on when you ask me, what day you ask me, but I think at least that Schelling could be pushed or radicalized in that way. So following the argument where it leads, I'm not going to be afraid to follow it to its most extreme possibility, in fact. Good. So I'm going to attempt to explicate Christ as the copula in this paper. This term copula, if you have the handout, is the is in a subject is predicate sentence, right? Schelling nowhere says explicitly something like Christ is the copula. But he will say, for example, that Christ is a Mittelwesen or das Mittleres, so the middle between two things, namely das Bond, or the middle between the human and the divine. And the copula serves this function in Schelling's philosophy as well, and so I think it's a very useful way to look at this sort of issue. So I will attempt to explicate Christ as the copula, that is to say, the incarnation of the Word or Logos, in order to argue that Christ is not human and divine, as is traditionally said, but that rather that Christ is neither human nor divine, at least not as such. Humanity and divinity are rather the two termini united by the differentiating enactment of the Logos as the act of copulation itself. So it is not a uniting of two natures, but it is rather the very separating, the bifurcating of two natures. Copulation only unites by differentiating. Thus, humanity and divinity are not pre-given data to be combined in the Incarnation, but they are both consequence of a primordial act or deed of copulation. The Logos is neither God the Father as the subject term proper, who would accept the form of, that is, acquire as a predicate nominative human nature, nor is the subject term Jesus of Nazareth, who would be predicated with divinity. So I don't start with the divine nature and I don't start with the human nature, but rather that between the two. To say that Christ is both human and God is neither to say that God became human, which tends toward Docetism, nor that a human became God, which tends toward Arianism. It rather says that that which is God is the same as that which is human. That which is already a middle nature, the Logos as the act of copulation, becomes God precisely by becoming human. A sort of monophysitism or Eutychianism that nevertheless ends with two natures. Yeah, so we begin with one, but we end with two. And so this rejects the traditional way one approaches Christology, at least in Schelling's consideration, where we begin with two natures and then try to make them one. So we're going the other way around. Good. Now this first section here is on copulation in Schelling, and my colleague here, Mark, I think has rightly pointed out to me that this is very dense material, and so I'm not going to read it for you, but rather I'm just going to try to talk through this first section on what the copula means in Schelling, and I'll have you constantly refer him here to this little handout that all of you, or hopefully all of you, have. At the bottom, you can see maybe the three main points you should take from it, but I'm going to refer to this little chart at the top as I talk through it. So to understand the copula in Schelling, first we have to understand that it has not merely linguistic ramifications, but also ontological ramifications. Right? So the copula, the copula is going to be transitive. The transitive nature of the copula means that it is not merely a subject being linked to some predicate nominative, but rather it actively generates both the subject and the predicate simultaneously. So its being itself is thought to be transitively because of the ontological ramifications we have here. So, as transitive, the is in a statement like subject is predicate means as much as can. Schelling says this explicitly, in fact. And so we have, thus the predicate is an accusative and not a predicate nominative that reduplicates the subject. So if the is means can, for example, the statement the couch is red would mean as much as the couch can or the couch is capable of red, understood transitively. A predicate is therefore not something that was already pre-contained in the idea of the subject. In other words, for Spinoza, all relationships are more or less analytic, where the attributes and modes, i.e. the predicate, is already somehow pre-contained in the infinite subject, or the infinite substance, rather. But Schelling says, rather, all assertions are going to be synthetic rather than analytic. So the predicate is never something pre-given in the subject, but it is always a novel production from the transitive act of the copula itself. Right? So this is his break from Spinozism. And it is also, therefore, a break from that merely logical relationship that he sees in Spinoza between subject and predicate, between infinite substance and the attributes and modes. In Spinoza, the relationship is one of the implicit and the explicit. The attributes and modes make explicit what was merely implicit in the infinite substance. For Schelling, however, the subject is now going to be posited as an antecedent and the predicate as a consequent, which means time comes into play. Antecedent, i.e. a prior, a past, a consequent, i.e. a future, a to come. So the is also transitive, which means it is transitory, as it were. There's a real transition. So it is a temporal relation rather than the merely logical relationship that we see in Spinoza. Right? So the couch is red would now mean something like the couch can bring about red as its consequent product. Something of that sort. So if subject is predicate means that the subject can the predicate, this means as much as to say that the subject has the potency to bring about a predicate other than its mere explication. So the subject, obviously you can't see from here, is always to be thought as potency for Schelling. The predicate always is act, right? Good. But This is the most important point if you take nothing away here in this part that I'm just explaining but not reading. We cannot think of the is as a third term. The is or the copula is always the first term or the originary term. And rather, both antecedent and consequent, both subject and predicate are themselves posterior or antecedents to the act of copulation itself. Good? And so the subject or the potency or the matter only acquires its identity as the subject that it is by means of the predicate. Right? So if you have, for example, in other words, if Schelling thinks of the subject as something like pure potency, he also thinks of it as something like prime matter. But prime matter is nothing apart from its consequent. Prime matter is nothing apart from form. And so the subject only is the subject that the subject is on account of the consequent. So as we'll see later, we have this strange logic that Levinas would call the posteriority of the anterior. The anterior subject only is the subject that it is on account of its posterior consequent. Yeah? I know this is lots of jargon. And even talking through it doesn't make it less jargon. Yes? But this stuff, if it's dry, you don't understand completely, that's fine. But I think it will help us understand later when I start reading through the paper. Good. So. The nature of the copula affords the insight that subject and predicate are not united from without as two pre-given elements. Schelling's Christology, therefore, does not assume two natures such that either the divine subject assumes, that is to say, descends to a human form, or a human subject would acquire, which is to say, ascends to a divine form, but rather the act of copulation as the disjunction between the two is the true anterior that enacts itself as two natures. Schelling does not add one nature to another, not 1 plus 1, which would already be on the way to tritheism. If we think of the Incarnation as adding one nature to another, then we're thinking of it as the formula 1 plus 1, which is already 1 plus 1 plus 1 tritheism, which we want to avoid, obviously. So he rather begins with the act of copulation, or the logos of God, that enacts itself in a twofold or a dual-natured manner. Humanity and divinity are the manners, or the modus operandi by which being copulates or enacts itself, or by which the verbum of God verbalizes itself. So the section here then is on the aporia of two natures, where Schelling's going to make explicit why we can't begin with two natures. So to assume two natures inevitably leads to the suspension of one and the other. Either Docetism, which suspends human nature, or Arianism, which suspends the divinity of Christ. Most typically, one asserts that the divine assumed humanity. This places the divine in the subject position, only to view humanity as a superfluous addition, predicated of the divine subject indeed, but without actually touching or altering the substance and essence of the divine subject. According to this traditional view, the divine only extensionally relates to human nature. They only relate from outside one another. It clothes itself with human nature, but the divine does not become human, which is what is demanded by Christology. It is, writes Schelling, quote, as if the divine personality merely took up or put on a human nature independent from itself, as one, for example, pulls on an outfit, end quote. Human nature is hence only a vehicle for the divine, a vicar. Schelling reiterates this criticism, stating, quote, one can say that A plus B, i.e. God plus human, is positive. Thus it does not necessarily follow that God has been changed in itself. It can have remained what it was. God has only entered into a relation that previously was not. But God has not become something else in itself, certainly not a human being. End quote. So whenever two natures are assumed in advance, only an external relation between them is possible, but a real transformation of the one into the other can never take place. Not even a mixing of two natures accomplishes that. God, on account of his immutability, cannot become human. That is, empty himself, lower himself, or denigrate himself unto human nature. And so here I think he has a critique of the kenosis theology of a Luther. Such is unbefitting for God because it entails a loss of God's divinity. The divine subject would be transformed into a human subject, but it would not be a divine subject retaining, let alone even acquiring its divinity in the very act of becoming human. And this is what is required by the notion that the same that is God is the same that is man. So the traditional view says that somehow God became man, and despite the fact that he took on human nature, remained God. This rather says that it only acquires divine nature precisely by taking on the human nature. So quite scandalous indeed. Any Christology worthy of the name seeks to describe the scandal that in the Christ event there is a being both fully God and fully human, and neither a transition from one to the other nor a mixture of the two. The demand is not for a composition of two natures, 1 plus 1, but that one be disjuncted as two, lest one lapse into tritheism, 1 plus 1 plus 1. The only escape from this impasse is to begin with not with two natures, but with the singularity of the copulating enactment, the logos of God, or what Schelling calls the, quote, outer divinely posited divinely, or the das außergöttlich gesetzte Göttliche. So the divine posited outside of itself. I can't go into what this means. I would have to go into a whole discussion of Schelling's Trinitarian doctrine and his doctrine of the potencies. But we have to understand then that what the datum of the Incarnation is not God himself, or not God's implicator, but it is rather God's Word, which is divine, but not the same as God himself, or God as such, or God's implicator. Yeah, but something already in between. So now we've, as it were, cleared away the wrong approach, beginning with two natures. And so hopefully now we can actually speak of how Schelling wants to speak of the Incarnation, after we know how we're not going to do it. So only the person of the Christ is the content of divine revelation. It is nothing revelation is nothing doctrinal nor dogmatic, even if one is repeating a holy text verbatim, that is to say, the idolatry of biblicism. But revelation is utterly historical enactment and not a historical content. The revelation is the historical person of the Christ and not his beliefs, teachings, or activities, apart, of course, from his death and resurrection, because I'm only preaching Christ crucified here, as Paul would say, and Schelling would say. The Bible is but the witness to this historical personage, a witness to the revelation, but not the revelation itself. The revelation is the historical enactment of the Logos, which materializes itself as the person of Christ, the God-man. So, what is the Incarnation? It is the materialization of the Logos. But materialization doesn't mean what you might think it means, but it's going to mean what matter means on this little sheet here. It's going to have a very technical sense of matter. The issue concerns the singular enactment of the Logos, or divine copula. The claim of Christology should be that the Logos that has materialized itself as man is the same that, in the same act, forfeits its separation from God and thereby manifests or reveals its divinity. And this word revelation here, I don't take it to be something merely epistemological. Revelation doesn't mean there's already something there, already something pre-existent, which I didn't know about, which is now unveiled. But revelation is a kind of creation of something novel that simply was not there before. And so the relationship of God to man is a novel one in the revelation. Prior to the Christ, the relationship of God to man, Schelling says, it was a merely natural one. He says this is what we find in mythology. He says, but in Revelation, that relationship is changed, and it is rather a personal relationship. And if something only is a person if it relates to something personally, then I want to argue God, in fact, only is as a person in the Incarnation and Revelation. So he's not already a person and then becomes known as one, but rather he becomes a person first in the Incarnation itself. So the scandal of the Christ event is that the Logos reveals the divine precisely by becoming human or by materializing itself, and not in spite of this materialization of itself. So recall the close relationship on your chart here between materialization, potentiation, subjectification, and subjection for Schelling. For something to materialize itself is for it to subject or subordinate itself to an ensuing consequent or superior. For it to yield its present actus and recede into potentia in order to make possible, that is, becoming the potency of the coming actus. In this way, something becomes matter for that which follows by positing itself as ground or substrate. This is classic Aristotelian notions of matter. Potency is to matter as actus to form. For something to be potent is for it to be the matter of something superior to itself. And so it subjects itself to a superior and becomes subject in the literal sense of hypokaimenon. Right? So, for the Logos to materialize itself is for it to become the ground of a consequent, to become the substance, or hypokaimenon, of that which it bears. Schelling comments, quote, with the word stuff, only the final hypokaimenon, only the materia ultima is intended, end quote. The act by which the Logos materializes itself as man is the same act by which the human nature of Christ becomes the substance or substrate of the actualization of divine personality. In good Aristotelian fashion, matters to potency as forms to act. The Logos could only be the Christ, that is, the actualization of the person of God, by incarnating itself, that is, by materializing itself as the potency of the divine personality. Without human nature being posited as subject, the divine cannot reign as the efficacious personality or form of this substrate. Humanity becomes the substance of the divine person. Without the incarnation, or more exactly materialization of the Logos, divine personality remains concealed rather than revealed. Revelation is a human divine enactment insofar as the Logos brings about the sovereignty of divine personality precisely by historically acting itself as man. So I'm going to read here again. It brings about the sovereignty of divine personality. This word sovereignty, or Herrschaft in German, Schelling says this is what is equal to Göttlichkeit. He says, what does it mean to be God? Wherein does godliness consist? He says, in sovereignty, or in Herrschaft. But something is only sovereign if it has something over which it can reign as sovereign. Hence, to be sovereign, it requires a substrate. So if God has no substrate over which he can reign, then he is not sovereign, and then he is not God. Yes? So it requires a substrate in order to reign as sovereign. So the copulating event is a free enactment of the Logos, of the divine posited out to divinely, albeit not the enactment of God's implicator. So again, if you read John 1:1 and John 1:2, it doesn't say that God became flesh, it says the Word became flesh. Again, the datum of the incarnation is the Word or the copula, and not God as such. The Logos copulates as subject and as predicate. That is, it materializes itself as the antecedent substrate and hypokamenon in order to ground the coming of, that is, the actualization of, God in the fallen world. Revelation is an enactment that alters the relation of the world to God, not a secret and esoteric dogma to which one must give epistemic consent. Revelation is ontological and not epistemic. And I think this is one of the primary problems with fundamentalism today, is that it thinks of revelation only in terms of epistemology. Simply, if you would say this statement and believe it, give your epistemic consent, then you would be saved. I don't buy into that at all, in fact. I want to think the revelation in ontological terms and not epistemic terms. So it is the incarnation of the Logos as the Christ, the materialization of the subject, or human nature, and the actualization of the predicate, divine personality. Through the incarnation, human nature becomes the potency of the actual predicate, the divine persona. Christ humanity becomes the potency or the power by which God is actualized as a procession of divine persons. Schelling can thus say that, quote, the divine in Christ is the Father who remains in him. I'm going to pause here for a minute. Earlier, it probably struck you as just nonsense when I was talking about the consequent being the condition of the identity of the antecedent, or the form of the predicate being the condition of the identity of the subject or the potency. But here we see, without the Son, which is in a certain sense eternally consequent, but consequent all the same upon the Father is not the Father. I did not become a father until I had my child, which means my child, qua consequent, is the posterior condition of my interior identity as Father. Right? Good. So in the procession of divine persons, the Father is posited as the first, that is, as the potency of the other two persons. Potency is the remainder always of an actuality. There's never pure potency, it's always the potency of something actual. So the potency is the remainder of actuality, and the Father is, in Christ, that is Logos incarnate, the indivisible remainder of the divine. God as subject, as abyss of power and potency. Without the Father, Christ is impotent, that is to say, without potency, and thus not divine at all. If, however, potency/subject never exists in advance of the actuality/predicate of which it is the potency, then one sees that the Father only comes to be as Father in the actual Son, in the Logos incarnate. God is not Father in advance of the Son, but only in the Son, or only as the potency of the incarnate Son. Far from the human and the divine constituting an impasse and contradiction, when viewed as termini of a singular enactment, a transitive act of copulation, the aporia dissolves, and the human and the divine belong together, each indispensable for the actualization and identity of the other. If one does not begin but only ends with two natures, then these natures can only be novel productions generated by the copulating enactment of the Logos. Christ is thus not the name for a combination of two natures, but it is the name that signifies the very generation of two natures in one. So as Christian Dahn's comments. Christian Dahn's, by the way, is a German author. The text is not translated, but he writes on Schelling's Christology. And as far as I know, he is the only person in the whole world who writes on Schelling's Christology. So if any of you are looking for master's or dissertation projects, there's plenty to do there, right? But as Dahn's comments, quote, "If Christ is the production of the product, so it is said with this that he can only be conceived from his self-enactment. Rather, first through this enactment of his entrance into history, does the Christ become the Christ," end quote. So even the Christ is not the Christ prior to the incarnation, of course. The material of the incarnation thus does not already exist in a pre-given human being. It is the enactment that makes Christ the Christ, and not the stuff of his nature. The stuff or matter of the incarnation is not to be found anywhere except through the very potentiation, and that means self-subjection or self-subjectification of the Logos itself, in order that the actual God may be revealed. This reading therefore truly thinks the incarnation as the incarnation of the Logos, rather than of God implicative. If the Logos were already to find its matter and substrate in something other than itself, in a human nature, then one could not truly say that the Logos itself has been incarnated, only that the Logos has found a human vehicle. The scandal of the incarnation, however, is the claim that Jesus, as the Christ, is not the Vicar of the Logos, but that the Logos is Christ incarnate. Had the Logos merely descended into a pre-given human body, that would not be incarnation, but inhabitation, a possession and a haunting, namely something demonic. I'm glad you all left your stones at home, or you're not paying attention. But he's saying the traditional Christological theory is in fact something demonic. It's an inhabitation, but being inhabited by something else, and not an incarnation. So two natures are indeed present in the person of the Christ, but only as consequences of the enactment of the Logos. Only in this way is Christ fully God and fully human, but not as a composition of both. The enactment of the Logos, if one will, is efficacious only per contrarium, or through its opposite. The divine and the human are united in Christ only because they are first decisively separated in Christ. Without the incarnation, then, God is not Father and the Logos is not Son. The incarnation is the enactment of the being of God as a Trinity, as a life of free persons. The incarnation is nothing that happens to God, but it is an event within the life of God. Without the incarnation, God would not prove to be the personal Lord. Again, personal means to be sovereign over something, means to be godly. Without the incarnation, God would not prove to be the personal Lord of being. That is, God would not be God, at least not God proper, not God in God's truth and propriety. The decision for an enactment of the incarnation is one and the same as the decision for an enactment of divine revelation. Schelling contends, quote, and this is one of two very important quotes by Schelling I have here. So Schelling says, quote, "The incarnation is only the highest act of its divinity itself. If the Son would divest himself of his divinity in the incarnation, then divinity would be invisible and concealed. His divinity would thus rather become invisible than visible." So any kind of sort of kenosis theology here is out. Because if Christ divests himself as divinity, then he doesn't reveal divinity, but he rather conceals it in the incarnation. So the incarnation is not the Logos' forfeiting of divinity, but it is the very act by which divinity is manifest. It only forfeits the divinity that it had outside of God, or Praeterbeing, as Schelling will say. Its independence from God. But the Logos surrenders its own will, demonstrating its obedience to the will of the Father. Schelling explains that, quote, "The Logos has not divested itself of its divinity, but only of the morphe, end quote. Nevertheless, this change in morphe is a change in the Logos itself, and not just a clothing that it puts on. To be in the morphe of the human being means more than that the human being becomes the mere vehicle by the human being that had arisen independently from him, then in himself no change would occur. He would remain in himself what he was, and in this respect this would not be a self-divestment in a real sense." End quote. Schelling suggests that such a union, so-called, between the divine and the human nature only amounts to nothing more than a moral union and not to a personal and substantive union. And I also think this is far too common where people think of the Christ as merely being some kind of a moral paradigm, right? Or a moral exemplar. But I'm giving a very strong ontological reading here rather than simply a moral reading. This has nothing to do with ethics, in other words. So should two natures be assumed as the prior conditions of the Incarnation, then one would be asserting that the Incarnation's possibility precedes its actuality, right? Because if I begin with the nature of the human being, it bears certain potencies or possibilities. If I begin with the nature of the divine, it bears certain potencies or possibilities. What I'm rather going to begin, as we'll see here, prior to all potency, or act precedes potency, as Schelling will say, in advance of the existentialist and in a sort of reformulation of medieval doctrine. This is what it means for act to precede potency. So as the prime exemplar of a free enactment, the Incarnation generates something original, that is to say, something unforeseeable in advance of its actuality. Because wherever something is already given as possible, we can anticipate it. But when something is original, then its act precedes its potency, which means its act precedes its possibility, which means I couldn't possibly anticipate it. It always appears as something novel and sudden. So Schelling writes, quote, "We only call original that from which the possibility is first given through the actuality," end quote. So when I go and I see original artwork like the Mona Lisa, and I say, wow, I couldn't even have imagined that something like this was possible until I now see that it's actual. In the original artwork, act precedes potency in this way. It was not possible. It was decidedly impossible until it was made possible by the fact that it was already actual. So in something original, act precedes potency, or actuality precedes possibility. Copulation is an original event that generates two termini as unforeseen and impossible novelties. Schelling draws the following conclusion, quote, "One must assert, according to the force of the expression sarx egeneto, or become flesh, that this sarx, or this flesh, would not only not have actuality, but not even possibility, without the will of the Logos to divest itself of the divine nature, that therefore human nature has no other terminus ex quo than the Logos itself." End quote. So, this second to last section, my last section is only like 2 paragraphs, this is the last week's section, is the Christ event as the actualization of the divine generation. So the customary theory, says Schelling, does not distinguish between the pure or simplicator being of God and being in morphe theou, or being as God, end quote. But that is precisely what Schelling's account is equipped to handle, precisely because of his account of the copula and the concomitant relation of subject and predicate. The idea of a subject simplicator is nonsense for Schelling. Just like the idea of potency by itself, not being the potency of some act, is nonsense, or prime matter, all nonsense for Schelling. That is so. There is no such thing as a subject, for example God, apart from the predicate, expression, or word that would actualize this subject as the subject that it is. For to be a subject is to be the matter of a form, to be the potency of an actuality. Potency is but the remainder of actuality, and hence nothing existing in advance of actuality. Note again Schelling's notion of originality, that act precedes potency. This is the meaning of the idea that act precedes potency. It is not the medieval notion of a first actuality, for older still is always the act of copulation itself, but it is the insight that a thing only is the thing that it is, the subject that it is, on account of its predicate or form. The consequent is the condition of the identity of the antecedent. Or better, an antecedent only is an antecedent if it has a consequent. So what does it mean to exist? It means to have a consequent. Yeah, I mean, something that has no consequence simply is not. Even God, apart from his form or determination, is but apeiron, or prime matter, the indefinite. Because what makes God definite is the form or the act. God only attains his propriety, that is only first truly God, through his determination, or through his expression or logos. This logos is not just in morphe theou, but it is the morphe theou as such. the actuality of God as such. Apart from God's word, expression, or eternally generated consequence, God simply is not. Here I like to write not, UGHT. God is, but only as void, only as vacuous existence without any sort of identity whatsoever. Certainly not the identity of a person that relates to the world in a free way. So apart from the revelation, that is the incarnation of his word, God is not God, at least not God as person. Minimally not the Trinitarian God and not the personal God. Dons presses this point, writing, quote, that the incarnation, that is, in German the word for incarnation is Menschwerdung, so I'll read it quite a literal translation. Don says, the becoming man of Christ is his becoming God, or the incarnation of Christ is his divinization, end quote. Far from these two natures constituting a contradiction, they are rather mutual conditions. The Christ event is the cornerstone to the actualization of God himself in his personhood and propriety. So at this point, I would just dare anyone to be more Christocentric than I or Schelling are being right now. I'm saying, in fact, without the Christ event, God is not even God. You cannot be more Christocentric than this. I couldn't possibly fathom out. For those of you who might want to throw stones at me later, remember that. Yeah. Now, Schelling comments, quote, everything substantial of the subject is in the incarnative, in that which has become human. But the divine is not the substantial, not the substrate. The divine is rather the uber-substantial of the subject. Remember, the divine means sovereignty, and sovereignty is only sovereignty that has something over which to reign. Uber. God proper is not non-substantial, but rather the uber-substantiality of the human substance or substrate. God only proves to be more than substance or uber-substantial by acquiring a substance for himself over which he can reign as Lord. God, apart from form and substance, is purely ethereal, a vacuous nullity, or not really God at all. Both the human and the divine natures are generated by the copulating activity which the Logos is, but the human nature operates as the substantiality of the divine, and the divine as its principle of actualization and determination, so that it's no longer operating indeterminate. That is, the divine operates as the principle of the uber-substantial or the personal. Just as the body, for example, the animality of a person is the substance over which one must prove oneself as sovereign lord and master in order to be called personal rather than beastly or slavish, so too with God. The substantiality of God could only have been posited by God's copulating enactment or by God as pure active copulation. But God cannot be uber-substantial, that is sovereign godly, without first having provided a ground or substance for himself. So why am I called a person? Because I'm not merely an automaton of my body, but somehow I'm sovereign over my body. And this is what it means to be a person. So what does it mean to be a person? It means to be sovereign. And what does it mean to be sovereign? Per Schelling, it means to be godly. Good. The act by which God proves himself as personal or uber-substantial, however, is not completed in the incarnation. Or, more exactly, since God only acts once, the incarnating enactment is only finished in the death and resurrection. By the way, this idea that God only acts once, I take it that if God could act twice, then we would have to posit that one act preceded the other or another act followed the other, in which case God would be temporal, not to mention the fact that we would be positing multiplicity in God. So in order to say God's multiplicity and God's eternity, I take it that every act in God is the same act. So the act by which he generated the sun, and the act by which he created the world, and the act by which he loves me, and the act by which he loves my two cats, are in fact one and the same act in God. No. So since God only acts once, the incarnation is only finished in the death and resurrection, because the death and resurrection are not two different acts than the incarnation. It's all the same act. So Schelling writes, quote, in this sacrifice, the divine breaks through the natural, and the uber-substantial breaks through the substantial, end quote. God is properly iconoclastic, only coming into his propriety by breaking his own substance, which proves unable to contain him. Without the crucifixion and the resurrection, which proves that the divine will is love and triumphs over death, Christ is not the Christ. Christ is not Christ simply by means of his materialization, but the act of the incarnation, the subjection of the Logos, is only complete with Christ's subjection to the cross. What Revelation really reveals is the will of the divine, of which there is only one, again. Revealed in the Logos, forfeiting its own will in order to know the will of the Father. Had Christ not been obedient unto death, he would have retained a particular will of his own and would not have been utterly abandoned or forsaken to the will of the Father. He would not have been a perfect transparency for the will of God, but retained an individual will that would have concealed the will of God. So instead of being revelation, it would have been concealing. And had he concealed the will of God, he would have concealed God himself, because God is nothing but his will, or his actus. So to have foregone the crucifixion would have been to have forestalled God in the procession of persons in the Trinity, a will to preclude the actualization of God, at least in his propriety and personhood. Revelation is not the representation of the true God, but the ontological event by which God comes into his truth as God. So, one paragraph left. Grand conclusion here on the possible, or no, a couple of paragraphs, on the exclusivity of the Christ God. If it is true that had the Logos not become incarnate as the Christ, that God would not be God, at least not in propriety, then can it also be said that the Christ event is the exclusive condition of the proper or personal being of God? That is a triune life of persons. Is it not the case that the divine is only, that is exclusively visible in the person of the Christ, and not just that divinity would not be visible apart from the Christ, but that it would not be at all? Again, that which does not admit of a consequent simply is not. Schelling quite radically states, here's that second very important quote by Schelling. Schelling says, the divine, as such, has not existed prior to the humanity, but only das Mittlere has, only the middle, the bond, the band between the human and the divine, the Copula has. The condition of the appearance of the divine is just the being of that which has become human. The divine is not there before the incarnation, but Christ is first God and man at the same time in the incarnation. Were he not actually human, so he could not also appear as God. End quote. The Logos copulates as God and as man, as the God-man. The subject of this enactment is neither God nor man, nor some pre-given God-man, but the very hyphen betwixt the two is what signifies the copulation or disjunction of the two natures. The copulation of the Logos occurs by means of the incarnation. It is thus truer to say that if there had been no incarnation, then God would not be God, than it is to say that the incarnation has taken place only because God already existed as the datum of incarnation. Let Schelling reiterate his thesis one last time. Quote, if the being which is human would not be, then so too would the being of the divine not be. Only because he is wholly and truly human is he divine. End quote. It thus seems plausible that Schelling would have considered the Christ event not only to have universal significance, but also a legitimate appeal to exclusivity. For it is the exclusive means by which God comes to be as true and personal, i.e. as God. To forego the Christ would be to forego God in his truth, namely a kind of atheism, in short. It's not the case that there is God and then he becomes incarnate, but if there were no incarnation, there would be no God. It's atheism. Enter the Protestant principle of Paul Tillich, which states that every bearer of the divine must be in protest against itself as the divine itself. Right? So for Tillich, Protestantism is to be in protest. The mediation of the divine can't set itself up as the divine unless idolatry. The true bearer or true revelation of divinity is one that in the same act by which it reveals the divine conceals itself as the bearer of the divine. What is required is a self-effacing event incapable of being regarded for itself, but only consisting as a transparency. I always think here in Mark where he says, good teacher to teacher, and Jesus says, why do you call me good? Don't you know no one is good but God? Jesus is saying, don't worship me, but rather worship through me. I'm a transparency not to be looked at, but rather through. So this criterion, I think, is met in the Christ event insofar as the human nature is the substance of the divine only by receding into potency, only by subjecting itself to the divine personality, only by offering itself merely as the edifice iconoclastically to be broken or crucified in order that the divine might prove itself as more than the substance which it shatters. God only reveals himself by proving always to outstrip any forms or apparitions, all dogmas and catechisms. The human substrate operates as nothing more than a transparent artifice to be looked through and not at. Jesus is not to be venerated on his own and as God, but yet it is exclusively through the Christ that one knows God and sees God. Christ is only Christ if obedient, that is self-effacing, even unto the point of crucifying the particularity of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross, in order that divine personality, thereby completely reigns over the human substance, now transfigured or glorified into a complete and utter transparency. So, if God only is as God in the Christ, then one here finds an argument for the exclusivity of the Christ. So if Schelling is right, and if God exists, which we haven't said, but if Schelling is right, and if God exists, then he is the God of the Christ, and not a pagan, Jewish, or Muslim God. Thank you.
The tradition at the Socratic Club is to promote conversation and discussion. We often prompt that by a respondent. We're very fortunate to have not one, but two Schelling scholars in the philosophy department right now. Dr. Mark Thomas in the philosophy department will offer a response.
So I first want to thank Tyler for a thought-provoking and provocative paper. And as a Schelling scholar, I'm always grateful for the opportunity to talk about Schelling. And I thought it was a really nice coincidence when I found out this summer there'd be two Schelling people on campus. Before commenting on Tyler's presentation, I would like to say a brief word about the context of this particular treatment of the Incarnation within Schelling's philosophical development. The textual basis of Tyler's presentation is primarily the Orphoslung, or the original version of the lectures on the philosophy of revelation, which Schelling gave in Munich in the early 1830s. Interestingly, in 1840, so about 10 years later, Schelling was called to Berlin by the King of Prussia to assume the chair of philosophy that was held by Hegel before his death. And in Berlin, Schelling gave a later version of these same lectures to great fanfare, and Kierkegaard and Friedrich Engels were among the attendees. The lectures on the philosophy of revelation come at the end of Schelling's long philosophical career. Schelling's first publication appeared in 1794, and he died in 1854, so 60 years later. Schelling is often portrayed as a protean figure who is constantly changing his philosophical views. This reputation is largely due to Hegel, who famously quipped that Schelling carried out his philosophical education in public. This view is a caricature. Schelling's philosophy displays profound continuity with respect to his central philosophical concerns, especially freedom. Nevertheless, Schelling's thought develops over the course of his long career, and his philosophical positions do change. It is therefore important to note that we are discussing today Schelling's views on the Incarnation toward the end of his philosophical development. Incidentally, my own research focuses on the period around Schelling's 1809 treatise on human freedom, which many regard as his magnum opus. Now to a discussion of Tyler's presentation. I would first like to say that I find the idea of reading the Incarnation in terms of Schelling's account of the Copula to be creative and helpful for understanding many of the things that Schelling says, especially his statement that the Logos, or the subject of the Incarnation, is neither God nor man. As far as I know, Schelling never explicitly makes the connection between the Incarnation and the Copula, but I think it's interesting and fruitful to apply Schelling's thought to itself. Tritten mentions a couple different accounts of the Copula in Schelling. The one that I find particularly helpful for understanding the Incarnation is what we might call the mediated account of the Copula, which Schelling originally develops in the Ages of the World, from 1811 to 1814. In fact, this mediated account of the Copula has its origins in Leibniz's discussion of the Trinity, so it has another theological context. According to the mediated account of the Copula, the statement A is B does not mean that A is completely the same as B. Instead, A is B means that the same thing X, that is A, is also B. In the treatise on freedom, Schelling gives the example, "This body is blue." This sentence means that the same thing X is in one respect this body, and in another respect blue. The most interesting feature about this account is that it introduces an element, X, that was not in the original statement, A is B. In the Ages of the World, Schelling designates this X the true copula. Thus, the true copula is not the word is, but a something. This X that underlies both A and B and allows them to form a unity. Because this account identifies the true copula as a something, Tritten is completely justified in saying that Christ, or the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, is the copula of two natures. The Logos is the same thing, the X, that is both A, human, and B, divine. Moreover, if we pose the question what X is in itself, the answer is that it is neither A nor B. The Logos, considered purely in itself as the underlying subject that unites two natures, is neither human nor divine. Incidentally, we can also apply this account of the copula to the Logos before the Incarnation. Before the Incarnation, the Logos is both A, in the form of God, and B, divine. I will say more about what that means in a little bit. Having said what I take to be Tyler's most creative contribution, I would now like to raise my main critical point with respect to his presentation. This concerns the way Tyler characterizes the act of incarnation. According to Tyler, the incarnation is the act by which the Logos posits or produces a human and a divine nature, neither of which preceded the incarnation. He also characterizes this act as the generation of two natures that are novel productions. Finally, he claims that the Logos acquires divinity through the incarnation, and that the Logos, quote, becomes God precisely by becoming human, unquote. There are two problems with this account, I find. First, Schelling himself characterizes the act of incarnation in very different terms. Again and again, Schelling describes the act of incarnation as a kenosis, or self-emptying, not as the production of two natures. It is true that one of the natures, Christ's human nature, is produced in the incarnation, but this is a direct result of the act of self-emptying. The second problem with the account is its characterization of Christ's divine nature as something derived and as a product of the incarnation. Instead, Schelling emphasizes that the divinity of Christ remains the same after the incarnation as it was before. What changes is that his divinity becomes visible or manifest when the Logos becomes flesh. I would like to develop both of these points in more detail. First, when considering Schelling's account of the incarnation, it is important to keep in mind that his account is grounded in two biblical texts. The first text is the famous prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The second text is the famous hymn in Paul's letter to the Philippians. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. There are at least two aspects of the passage in Philippians that are essential for Schelling's account of the incarnation. Above all, Schelling emphasizes the moment of self-emptying, in Greek, the kenosis, which constitutes the act of incarnation itself. Schelling most frequently translates emptying, kenosis, with the German verb entäußern, to relinquish or to divest. And entäußern and its cognates appear again and again in the 40 or so pages Schelling devotes to the incarnation in the Orthosum. But what does this self-emptying or relinquishing involve for Schelling? Here is where a second aspect of the passage in Philippians comes into play. Its reference to Christ being in the form of God, in morphe theou. Before the incarnation, Christ was in the form of God. The act of self-emptying involves Christ's giving up or relinquishing the form of God and thereby assuming human form. Schelling notes that this relinquishing of the form of God was, quote, the only cause of the existence of the man Jesus, unquote. However, Schelling emphasizes that relinquishing the form of God does not involve relinquishing divinity or the divine nature. The Logos, which is the agent of the incarnation, was truly divine before the incarnation and remains truly divine afterward, despite giving up the form of God. Here, Schelling provides a somewhat idiosyncratic interpretation of what the phrase form of God means, and he carefully distinguishes it from divinity. Being in the form of God actually means being outside of God, außer Gott sein. In the time between the fall of man and the Incarnation, the Logos was outside of the Father. Although the Logos shared the true divinity of the Father, this divinity was concealed by the form of God. By divesting himself of the form of God in the Incarnation, the Logos, or Christ, reveals his true divinity. This leads me to the second problem with Tyler's account, namely the claim that Christ's divine nature is first produced or generated in the act of incarnation. As I have noted, Christ was already divine before the Incarnation, although the form of God concealed his divinity. It is therefore false to say that the Incarnation produces this divinity. Instead, Christ's becoming flesh makes visible the divinity that was already there. Schelling says this quite explicitly, quote, "Christ has become revealed through the Incarnation. His becoming man is precisely the revealing of the divine in him, and this divine is that by which he is the one with the Father. The only thing that can be revealed is what was already there before, but was hidden." I think this is a central line. The only thing that can be revealed is what was already there before, but was hidden. From this passage, it is clear why Christ had to have been divine before the Incarnation. If his divinity were not already present in a hidden form, it could not have been revealed in the act of becoming man. Moreover, Schelling is also concerned to preserve both the continuity of the divine nature through the process of incarnation, as well as the immutability of this nature. Schelling writes that, quote, "The true divinity has remained, only that before the Incarnation the divinity is invisible, through the Incarnation the divinity becomes visible. It is far from being the case that the divinity has changed through the Incarnation. Instead, the Incarnation has proven in the most determinate way the immutability of the divinity. It has been shown that the subject, the Logos, which was in the form of God and outside of God, has not ceased being with God, essentially." Unquote. Since Schelling affirms divine immutability in this passage, we cannot say that the Incarnation adds something to the divinity that was not there before. What is added is simply the manifestation or the visibility of what was already there from the beginning. Admittedly, there is a passage that Tyler cites from the 69th lecture where Schelling seems to be saying that Christ's humanity is a condition of his divinity. This lecture comes after Schelling's treatment of the Incarnation in the preceding 6 lectures, and in particular this lecture concerns the relationship between the divine and human natures once Christ has already become man. Accordingly, I don't believe that Schelling is saying here that Christ's humanity is a condition of his true divinity. This would be inconsistent with what he had said repeatedly in the previous 6 lectures, and it would seem to come out of nowhere. In the surrounding context in this very lecture, Schelling states that Christ's humanity is a condition of the appearance or the manifestation of his divinity, which was previously veiled by the form of God. I take this to be the meaning of the quotations that Tyler cites. The majority of Tyler's paper concerns the act of incarnation, but the paper ends with conclusions about Schelling's religious exclusivism. I would also like to pose a critical question about this phrase as it applies to Schelling. What does it mean to affirm a religious exclusivism? In one sense, this could mean to believe that one's own religion, in this case Christianity, alone has access to the full truth, and that other religions either contain false elements or are otherwise incomplete. In this sense, it is indeed true that Schelling is a religious exclusivist, but there is nothing particularly noteworthy about this from a historical point of view. However, Tyler seems to be claiming that Schelling's Christology entails a stronger sense of religious exclusivism. He states that foregoing Christ would be tantamount to atheism, and that God is not a pagan, Jewish, or Muslim God. Now correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems to imply that non-Christian religions not only don't have access to the full truth about God, they don't have access to any truth about God. This entire philosophy of revelation. Other religions, indeed all religions as such, have some share in the truth about God, albeit in an imperfect fashion. In the very first lecture of the Orphassum, Lectures on the Philosophy of Revelation, Schelling states, the content of all religions is the same, but the content in false religions is incorrectly arranged and thereby distorted. Christianity as the true religion is the result of a movement through the inadequate forms of religion as steps toward the truth. This is why Schelling devotes so much of the lectures to a discussion of mythology and pagan religion. Schelling writes, quote, "The content of truth is an eternal content. Thus, Christianity must have already been present in paganism if Christianity is the true religion. Paganism has the very same substantial content that is revealed in Christianity in its complete truth." Unquote. What is true about paganism is even more true about Judaism for Schelling, since Judaism is a revealed religion. The God revealed in Judaism is most emphatically the God of Christianity for Schelling, although God is not fully revealed in Judaism. Schelling even speaks of the pre-existence of the Logos in Judaism and even in paganism. In this respect, one might very well conclude that Schelling is a religious inclusivist. Finally, I would like to end with a question that is as much a question for Schelling as it is for Tyler. How is Schelling's discussion of the Incarnation philosophy and not theology? It would strike most philosophers as strange to be discussing the Incarnation in a philosophical context, especially since the Incarnation is being affirmed as true not in some metaphorical sense, but as a historical and supernatural occurrence that cannot be known by reason alone. And it actually involves something miraculous. Schelling affirms the virgin birth, that Christ did not have a human father. So it involves a miraculous occurrence, something that cannot be known by reason alone. According to the traditional distinction between philosophy and theology, philosophy remains within the limits of reason alone, while theology takes as its starting point the truths of revelation and seeks to understand these truths through reason. Would Schelling reject this distinction between philosophy and theology, or would he draw the line between the two somewhere else? One might argue that for a Christian doing philosophy, the distinction between philosophy and theology is not very important. What is important is the truth about God, or what Augustine calls Christian wisdom. Indeed, this distinction between philosophy and theology does not seem to be very important for Augustine himself, and the line between the two is blurred even in St. Thomas. In a more contemporary context, Alvin Plantinga has argued for doing Christian philosophy. Not all philosophers agree on first principles. Christian philosophers, he contends, agree on the fundamental truths of Christianity, and they can use these truths as principles when doing philosophy. I think there's probably no greater difference between two philosophers than between Alvin Plantinga and Schelling, but nevertheless, I think maybe we can pose the question if they're similar in at least this respect. So I'll end with that question. Is the distinction between philosophy and theology no longer important for Schelling, and should it be? So I want to end by thanking Tyler again for a very thought-provoking presentation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Tyler, there was a lot of substantive comment in Mark's remarks. We're a little limited on time, so you can choose if you want to take a couple minutes and make a couple responses, or if you want to start with questions. I'll leave that up to you.
Well, I think I can respond in general shortly without going on to every point in detail, because both of the main criticisms I think I can hopefully make better by saying that it is not the case that it is, and I stated this poorly at the beginning of the paper, and I think it's better later, but what is changed is not the production of the divine nature, but the relation of God to man is changed. And the relation is now personal rather than impersonal. Hence, that would cohere with what he says about these other religions, that they do contain elements that are already Christian, but they contain them in the wrong way, namely impersonally. And so it's the relation that is novel, and not some content which is added, as it were. And so God, I think the claim is that God is only God as a person. He makes a difference between divinity, which is a third term a thing, and God, which is a second term, a person, in a nutshell.
Excellent, thank you. Questions?
Yeah,
Yeah, you're in charge.
I think.
Mark, could you pull the podium away?
yeah,
So, thanks.
Dwayne, I'm not going to be revealed.
There you go.
Yeah, this is for Tyler. What's the benefit of Schelling's reading over traditional Christology? So why go into this? What's the proof of this?
Well, if we believe Schelling, and I think both Mark and I were convinced on this point, traditional Christology begins two natures and simply leads to an impasse intellectually. I can make no sense of this. If I start with two natures and ask how they can be combined, I am led into how can we speak. But if I begin with some third, so as Mark said, the mediative account of the Copula, that which is God is that which is human, or X is A and X is B. So it's not that God which is human or human which is God, but something other than both is both God and human. And in that way, we can make it work.
I found your paper just terrifically helpful. You focused on the God issue, but everything you say about God, wouldn't that also apply to humanity? So that humanity doesn't pre-exist the Incarnation?
The humanity of Jesus, at least, yeah.
The humanity revealed by Jesus, the humanity created by Jesus, the relationship between God and man and Jesus? I mean, what is it that doesn't pre-exist?
The will to the Incarnation is eternal. But of course, the effect, obviously quite temporal, because it happened at some specific point in time, right? And so the relation to humanity changes drastically in the Revelation.
And so humanity's relation to God changes.
And yes, so humanity's relation to God also changes.
But does Schelling want to have a fully reciprocal relationship between God and man? So that whatever you say about God, you can also say about man? Whatever, because you were saying,
No.
everything we say about man, you can say about God.
If it was
because
the
man
case that
is-
whatever I could say about God, I could say about man, and whatever I could say about man, I
Yeah.
could say about God, would mean that the is was reduplicative rather than transitive. But because the is transitive, this is like saying in John 1:1, there is a difference between saying the Word was God and God was the Word. Right?
But I guess I don't see that. If what pre-exists the Incarnation is the copula, the copula is as much humanity as it is God, right?
It's neither.
Okay, so
As
it's
such.
So humanity is emerging from the copula as much as God's emerging from the copula.
Yeah, okay, I think maybe part of the question stems from something I didn't discuss in the paper, but we can speak of the copula on two different levels here, or the logos on two different levels. I would want to appeal to the Stoics here and make a difference between the logos indiathetos and the logos perforicos, or the implicit logos and the explicit logos, or even, I guess Kirby's not here, but Maurice Merleau-Ponty would call the logos sauvage, or the savage logos, and then, get the counterpart here, the explicit logo. And God as such is this logos indiathetos, this savage logos, whereas the logos proper, the second person of the Trinity, if you will, is the logos made explicit. And so there's also a duality in the logos itself, as it were. So this duality, subject and predicate, gets mirrored back and forth up to higher and higher levels of reality.
So how does that help me how does that make what I say about God and what I say about man asymmetrical?
Because if they were symmetrical, then the phrase, the Word was God, could just as equally be understood, and God was the Word. Or the is means as much as an equal sign.
But
because,
isn't that what you're saying?
no, it's not an equal sign. It's a transitive relationship, which means one is posited as the subject, as the antecedent, as the potency of the other, which is posited as the act, as the consequent. So one does not precede the other, but one is posited as past and as future. Was the past there before the future? No.
But can't you say that about man?
say what about me?
That God is, that the Logos is the potency of man.
Well,
And that man is the predicate of the Logos.
because the logos is not potency but pure act. What is potency is the subject. What is act in a concrete sense is the form. But the logos between the two, the active copulation bifurcates the two. It's in fact actus purus prior to all potentia. So the logos doesn't even activate pre-given potentialities, but it generates novelties which were impossible prior to their generation.
So humanity would be impossible prior to the Incarnation.
Right, which means humanity is an original creation, an original production, which means as much as an unforeseeable one which is impossible until it was actual. God always creates only the impossible.
So,
He's never created anything possible.
so if humanity is only possible after the Incarnation, that helps us understand the sense in which God is only possible after the Incarnation. Because it isn't like there weren't human beings before the Incarnation.
Right. For anything which can be called original, it can only be spoken of as possible post facto, or after the act. That's true of anything that we would call it, even the free human being. Someone does something, you're like, whoa, I didn't even know that was possible. What does that mean? That means, good grief, that wasn't possible until I now see that it's act. Which means act precedes potency, which is his reorientation of the traditional medieval doctrine and his being a precursor to existentialist doctrine of existence precedes essence. So the existent only is the existent that the existent is on account of the essence that it produces consequence.
I got another question, but I want to.
Well, if I might just add something, back to the question of whether the is an equal sign. For Schelling, for two things to be meaningfully identified, they also have to be distinguished. And so there's always a matter of identity within difference, or difference within the identity. And so in his various accounts of the Copula, he's always trying to negotiate that relationship between the identity and the difference.
Okay, my other question is, can I betray myself? In other words, if my potentiality is only real in my realization, right, or the potentialization of myself, then am I not whatever I become? I mean,
Yes.
Okay, so I can't betray myself then.
Well, you can in the way that, Sartre might say you have bad faith, even though you only already have.
So tell me how that's possible. Tell me how,
Just like a person. We'll make it mundane. We don't even talk about God. We don't talk about God. Just like a person. And you say, well, so-and-so, this person is nice. Well, and they're nice, and they're not, but they have to reprove their niceness every day. And then one day they go out and do something heinous, and you're like, well, I guess I was wrong. Which means the proof is a running proof, which is actually the proof Schelling says has for God's existence, which I didn't talk about at all, but he calls it a proof that runs per posteritas, within the posterior, through the consequent. And then he calls it ein laufender Beweis, or a running proof.
So
because that's to be done every day, over and over and over and
So
over.
So the guy didn't betray himself when he murdered somebody. That's who he is.
God is
the
God
guy who one
because he
day
does
has
not betray
killed
himself.
somebody.
But it's not the case that God can't betray himself, because then there would be no merit in him not betraying himself. He is only God because he decisively, via his act, does not betray himself, even though he could.
Well, the way I'm understanding you is you can't betray yourself, right? Because that would mean you are something that you didn't have to be. That there was a potency that you failed to realize. And that's what it means to betray yourself.
Well, of course there's potencies you fail to realize. That's what it means to be decisive. To be decisive is to actualize one thing and cut off all other potencies as no longer possible.
But they never were.
Yeah, I agree.
They're
So,
ephemeral.
the original deed is that which actualizes the possible before it was possible, and depossibilizes the impossible before it was possible. I agree. Sure.
I'm going to ask you a question I always ask you, which is why the Christ, right, and not some god like Dionysius, who also is both man
Then I wish you'd stop asking me that.
I know, it's terrible.
Because I buy in here to where in the last paragraph, I introduced randomly, seemingly, Paul Tillich's Protestant principle. Because I think the story of the Christ is a peculiar one, and that in the Christ event, the substrate, the human substrate, is crucified, is done away with, such that all that remains is the divine. And so the Christ event is this transparency where the bearer of the divine effaces itself as the bearer of the divine, such that all that can be seen is the divine rather than the divine and the particularity of the human, i.e. Jesus of Nazareth. And I find that to be a very particular kind of story that I don't see elsewhere, where there's a claim that says, well, only one God exists. Okay, but then what's the identity of that one God, et cetera, et cetera. But you can harp on me.
Again, of the lie, a really confused understanding of this whole framework by asking this question, but it's the only way I'm going to get clear. When you described the mediated account of the copula, you talked about what it means to say that A is B, say the couch is red, is to say that some X, that is A, is also B.
Right.
How does this, and then X is the true copula. So how do we avoid an infinite regress problem here?
And you want to spell that out, the infinite regress problem?
Yeah,
In other
so-
words, like, if X is A, then you have to explain what is means in that sentence, and you have
Precisely.
to... Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, one way of answering it is that Schelling's account of the copula applies, this particular account of the copula only applies to certain statements, of certain instances of the word is. And there's a different kind of predication happening, what I would call a essential predication in the X is A statement, where you don't have any mediation involved, but A is predicated directly of the essence, which is X. But this is actually quite, this is developed much earlier on, 1811 to 1814 in his Ages of the World. But Schelling doesn't distinguish. He actually makes the claim that his account of the copula applies universally, but he would run into the very problem that you have identified, this infinite regression. And so I think that there are actually three different kinds of uses of the word is. There's the mediated one. There's the essential one that I just mentioned, where X is identified with A, X is A. But then there's also X is X, and that's the third meaning of the is, and there you do actually have a numerical identity, where you have an identity without difference. Showing Piston again and again that identity always requires difference, but then at certain points in his writings, he comes back and says, well, there is this what he calls an Einerleibheit, or a sameness without difference, when X is identified with itself.
Is that a tautology or existential?
Yeah, tautology, yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Brian?
Yeah, I have a question for Mark and Tyler. Mark, just a clarification. You said, I maybe Tyler already mentioned this. What does it mean to say it was hidden? Isn't God's nature was hidden? Hidden to whom? To God himself or to human beings? And then, in the Christ event, it's revealed. Who's this hidden to?
Yeah, it's hidden to human beings.
Hidden to human beings.
That's my interpretation. I think maybe Tyler would read it in a different way.
It seems to be Tyler saying it's hidden to God himself. Or not?
Yeah, but I'll let Tyler answer for himself. But it's hidden by the form of God, which Schelling gives a very somewhat idiosyncratic interpretation of what that means. It's kind of being outside of God, and even though the Son is essentially one with the Father, that essential oneness with the Father is hidden until he divests himself of this form of God in his humanity and becomes visible to human beings.
And I just wanted to ask Tyler too, why, I think you said this, maybe I misunderstood. Why, if we assume two natures, does that lead to tritheism? 1 plus 1 plus 1? You said that?
Right.
Two natures leading to tritheism?
Because then I'm beginning with three entities that I'm trying to combine in some way, right? Which I take to be a losing game.
What are the three then?
Well, I mean, the three, of course, when we get to Tritheism, are Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? But if the Son is only the Son because of the Incarnation, that's the claim I'm trying to make, and the Father, therefore, only the Father because of the Incarnation. If we start down that path even of positing one entity on top of another entity, then I don't see how we can escape the conclusion of Tritheism. But rather, if we start with not even one entity, actually, I don't even really start with one, but I start with a nothing that copulates itself, that verbs itself. God is a verb, God is pure act. Then the three natures are here. So he's much closer to modalism than Tritheism. They become manners or modalities, modus operandi of one and the same act. So they are adverbial, as it were, rather than adding three nouns one to another.
So you would say something like Augustine's idea of Trinity leads to Triton, or not necessarily, or?
I don't want to pretend to be an expert in Augustine here and say I would know that for sure. But he would say Schelling would make the claim that any Christology that starts with the assumption of two natures would ultimately lead also in its Trinitarian doctrine to a tritheism.
So does Schelling understand interreligious dialogue as just people talking past one another, but they're not even talking about the same thing?
I don't know that he had a notion of interreligious dialogue. It's interesting to see. Is interreligious dialogue distinguished from ecumenical dialogue? Or would you?
Yeah, I want to make it non-Christian.
Non-Christian, okay. Because
Yeah.
it is interesting that he lectured for much of his career in Munich. And though Schelling was Protestant and he was the son of a Protestant a Lutheran pastor, Munich is a very Catholic city, and he actually got along well after he established himself there. I'm not aware of anything like interreligious dialogues. He was very interested in other religions. But I don't think they would say that people were talking past one another just because those religions do have elements that will appear later in Christianity, and so we can look at common elements and talk about those common elements.
I didn't say Christianity was the exclusive. I said the God of Christ is the exclusive.
Right. Which is not the God of
Christianity, for Schelling, is also something that will be surpassed, hopefully, when he goes philosophical religion and the like. Because all forms and dogmas, as I said, will be surpassed. But the Christ event, that cannot be surpassed. But that's something different in Christendom, as our Schelling and our friend Kierkegaard would know. But also, yeah, he talks about all of these religions. He talks about Islamic religion, he talks about Greek religion, he talks about Zaydism.
Is the God of Islam the God of Christianity?
So the divinity, the divine, and the same divinity is in all of these religions, but it is in them in a distorted form. And so in all of these other religions, he says, divinity, not God as person, but divinity merely, relates to human consciousness in a natural way and in a way that it transfixes consciousness. So it has almost a slavish relation to it, hence why all these sacrifices and rituals, there's this very foreboding element. And only in the Christ is the, again, not the content of divinity changed, but the relationship is changed in Revelation, where it's now no longer a natural relationship, but it is a personal and free relationship. So Revelation changes the relationship to God, not the content.
But Islam, I think, is a really interesting example, and I'd like to ask Schelling what he thinks of Islam, because I was actually preparing for today. I was looking for references, and they're only very scattered discussions. He doesn't really have anything very developed. I think part of the problem is that Islam follows Christianity, whereas most of the religions he talks about precede Christianity, and he has them build up to Christianity as the kind of culmination. And so in Islam we have the claim to a revealed religion that follows Christianity that seems rather problematic with this scheme.
And this is not politically correct, but he said all of these religions have their moment in which they're saying something true, and there's a succession as they lead up to Christianity. He says, but once their moment passes, if you cling to that moment, it's fetishism. He says, so most of these religions, at their time, were just fine. But now when their time has passed, but we still cling to it, they officially become fetishized.
I mean, and I think that's consonant with where understandings of other religions by Christian theologians was in the early 19th century. But I think that would mean that Schelling's understanding of God is pretty useless for interreligious dialogue today.
It's an interesting question.
I mean, do we really want to enter into dialogue with other religions with an a priori knowledge that they're fetishes?
No.
We'll have to change the language to begin with.
Nor do we want to enter into dialogue with them with an a priori knowledge that we're always also talking about the same thing either. Because then that...
Well, that goes to my question of whether we're inevitably talking past one another, that we're talking about different gods.
Well, I think, people like Wittgenstein might be helpful here, where maybe we each have to participate in different games, and to participate in the game in the Judy way, I have to play it in a committed way. But that doesn't...
Then my learning Buddhism is like a baseball player learning chess. It really doesn't help his game at all.
Right. I'm only going to be probably convicted by, well, maybe none of them, but I mean, I always talk, Martin Nussbaum, maybe the Lutheran one too, and he's talking about interreligious dialogue. How wouldn't it be great if we could have under the Christmas tree, the pagan symbol, the dreidel, the menorah, all right next to the manger scene, and this would be great and wonderful.
Yeah.
And I thought, no, this is nauseating. It would make me want to throw up. Because then all of the symbols lose their meaning. So it's not respecting all of them. It's defaming, or it's.
But could we possibly have something to learn from it? Only if we're talking about, in some respect, the same thing, right?
I wouldn't buy that only for funds. I wouldn't say that. No. I say we.
Does chess have anything to
Well, I
learn
mean,
from
Schelling
baseball?
certainly thinks that it's important to have knowledge of those other religions.
Why?
Because we can only understand what Christianity is as the end of a historical process that builds upon all these previous manifestations of religion. And so he was very much interested in exploring the details. I mean, what's it, like 700, 800 pages? Most of that is occupied with non-Christian religions.
And he'll say, Christianity
But only
cannot
as-
be understood apart from the history of mythology.
But only as immature forms of Christianity.